Does the U.S. Army need another war to fix its recruitment problems, but more important, to stay combat effective? Because the U.S. Army finds itself in a very unique position, almost a double-edged sword, because it's a good thing to not be in a conflict and a war, but at the same time, the U.S. Army is starting to see the effects of recruits not joining the Army, and all of these combat veterans who have served in the last 20 years, where the U.S. Army has seen the most deployed troops, the most combat effective force ever, it's starting to dwindle. So in this video, we're going to actually look at historical trends before, during, and after wars and how the U.S. Army has always managed to figure it out. They've always managed to get through the conflict, or at least enlist soldiers when they need to. But again, I did say the U.S. Army is in a very unique position, so we'll get to that towards the middle of the video. So please stick with me because we need to get through all this context first. Okay, so first things first, so you have a little context. The U.S. Army recruitment is complaining that the numbers are low. We have not met our recruitment numbers once again. In fact, we have an actual number here, 452,000 active duty soldiers today. It's the smallest full-time force since 1940. So let's go ahead and go to 1940, which is right before the start of World War II, or the beginning for the U.S. forces going into World War II. Now, the stats here in the jump is absolutely insane, but again, you can see at the beginning of the conflict, 269,023 active duty soldiers, and then all of a sudden, 1 year later, 1.4 million active duty soldiers. That jump is fast, but again, during the war, you get more and more and more, but it goes to show that during trends of war and conflict, your army starts to become stronger, more powerful, and you tend to enlist more and more soldiers to defeat the enemies of the United States, or at least keep a campaign going. We also need to understand that the duties of the U.S. soldier was very unique because we're talking fighting across all of Europe, but also a Pacific campaign. So the U.S. Army was enlisting left and right to fulfill the needs of what the U.S. Army needed. Now, we'll jump to the Vietnam War because this is the next massive spike we see in 1968. 1.5 million soldiers, active duty soldiers, are fighting in the U.S. Army. But you can see the trend down here, how at the very beginning of the conflict, Vietnam is also a little interesting and unique, where it started technically back in the 50s, but in 68 you had what was called the Tet Offensive, and the U.S. Army realized this is going to be a war of attrition, man versus man, every single number counts. So the U.S. Army said, you know what, because we need to fulfill the needs of the Army in this specific task and campaign in Vietnam, enlist everyone, get everyone to join the Army. Now again, I know what some of you are saying. You're like, well, we had a draft. Yes, that's true, and this actually will bring us to our next point and transition into the video, where we do still have a draft, but the draft hasn't been implemented like we saw in Vietnam and back in World War II. However, historically speaking, and per U.S. law, you can see how effective that draft is by enlisting soldiers on a moment's notice. So the next big campaign is Desert Storm, 1990 to 91. However, this was a 45-day conflict and about only 100 hours of actual combat, boots on the ground. Now, because this conflict happened so fast, the U.S. Army used what the U.S. Army had, which is about 769,000 troops. So as we can see, from 89 to 91, it goes down a little bit, 769,000 down to 710,000. But then from here, we have the ultimate garrison army, the entire 90s, where you just go down and down and down, where you almost reach as low as today, down to 491,000, 480,000. And during this time, you have a garrison army where you're just training and training. Mixed reviews. Some people say it was terrible. Some people loved it because of the uniforms. Nonetheless, this period of time is probably the least combat effective fighting force for its time in the U.S. military, historically speaking, because we just weren't in a campaign. Now, remember what I said about the U.S. Army. Historically speaking, and when you look at the chart of how many people were fighting at the time, the U.S. Army tends to fill the ranks as per mission needs. So during almost the last 20 years of the GWOT era, the Global War on Terror, you were fighting a small contingent force of rebel fighters in the mountains, some urban warfare. Now, the Iraq War was unique because for about a month you had big warfare versus the actual Iraqi professional military, but then that all ended where we were fighting insurgency. So because of this, you're actually going to see the numbers are not as high as you would think they are. In fact, I actually thought the numbers were a little higher considering we were fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan. But again, historically speaking, the U.S. Army will fill in the gaps according to the mission. So you'll actually see, beginning in 2001, these numbers are not as high as you would expect. But again, this is because the U.S. military, especially the Army, you're fighting insurgencies. You don't need these mass numbers like you saw in Vietnam, where we were fighting the Viet Cong, but let's be honest, we were actually fighting a professional military at the time, or as professional as they were going to get. We were talking like mass amounts of numbers, like we're competing against another big military. But during the entire GWA era, the numbers were never really that high. And so the question is this: what is the U.S. Army complaining about if we're only short about 30,000 to 40,000 troops that we were at before? Like, am I missing something? What is happening? Well, here's what I think is happening. The U.S. Army, again, has been fighting this insurgency battle where it's not a one-on-one big military versus big military, so there was never the worry or the need to have mass amounts of troops. But what we're seeing today, and what the U.S. Army has actually always struggled with in the last 20 years, is staying relevant in modern combat, like Ukraine versus Russia. And I think the United States Army is starting to realize we might need to bump these numbers up in case we do get involved with NATO or get involved with fighting a military like Russia, where we actually don't have as big as manpower or as many troops as we want, according to the mission's needs. Now, fortunately for the U.S. Army, we have a massive population to actually pick from. In fact, we have 123 million people who are technically fit for service, which is 36%. That is huge. Also, as far as the U.S. Army is concerned, they like to say, well, we have 466,000 active duty fighters. This is really low, or about 440,000. But the part they always forget to tell you is we also have 176,000 reserve fighters and 435,000 National Guard fighters. So to me, I'm going to be honest with you, the U.S. Army definitely has enough fighters in case something does pop off, but nonetheless, they want to have these active duty soldiers who do military work full time to be prepared for a fight. Now, the last time we saw a war almost as close as Ukraine and Russia as far as the United States is concerned is back in Desert Storm, and we had troops up in the 710,000. That's just active duty soldiers. We could assume we have way more reserves and National Guards, and again, a massive pool of soldiers to pick from. But at this time, this is a more fast-paced war, a lightning war, where again, it is mobilization of tracked vehicles, and that's what the U.S. Army seems to be focusing on and what they predict will be the next fight. And don't get it twisted, the U.S. military, especially the Army, they are still involved with an insurgency battle throughout the world, whether it's in Africa, whether it's in Syria, some little parts of the Middle East, and probably some other black ops things we don't know about. So the U.S. Army definitely can still perform and still be combat effective today, to answer our question at the beginning of the video. But does the U.S. Army need a World War III or another war to be combat effective or to be relevant in today's military space? I think absolutely not. Because again, when you look at the actual numbers, the real number for today's Army is over 1 million troops, and this is with the National Guard, reserve component, and active duty component. That is right now. If we had to deploy right now, this is who we could deploy. It's actually ranked 4 out of 145. And you have to also understand this. Being combat effective and being ready for the mission is all relative. Were we ready for Vietnam? Not really, but as soon as we started to enlist soldiers immediately, then we were ready for Vietnam. Were we ready for World War II? No, we weren't, but you saw that next year, we jumped up almost 1 million troops, then 3 million troops. So again, a lot of it is relative, and it all has to do with what the U.S. Army has to do at the time or wants to be ready for. Now, as far as losing combat effectiveness, I think the U.S. Army is trying to stay as relevant as possible by training with Ukrainian troops and training with other nations who have combat experience. You'd be surprised, training with the Ukrainians might be the best thing for the U.S. military because we're actually getting to see how our big military strategy would work against an enemy like Russia. Because let's be honest, the enemy of the United States, China, Russia, North Korea. Those are the big players, and of course, Iran. And so, with the U.S. military and the U.S. Army working with the Ukrainians, the U.S. Army is still able to be combat effective and still be relevant in today's military space. So, at the end of the day, yes, we do have a recruitment problem, relatively speaking. We are at an all-time low, but we're also at the tail end of a 20-year dragged on GWOT era, global war on terror. And of course, it's going to take some time to rebound. Would a war be good for the U.S. Army? Yes, but it'd also be bad for the U.S. Army. Will it keep the U.S. Army relevant? Yes, but also not being in conflict still keeps us relevant. And like the trends we saw in Vietnam, and we're sort of feeling the effects today, where you had mass amounts of troops in the army, everybody had combat experience and deployed experience, eventually this starts to die out and the trend starts to go down. Nonetheless, the U.S. Army still remembers and still practices what we learned from Vietnam. A lot of people like to say, oh, we lost in Vietnam, but in the long run, we actually still use the tactics in Vietnam that we did throughout the GWOT era, and we still use it today. So again, everything is relative to the task and mission for the U.S. Army. And let's be honest, if the U.S. Army really wanted more troops, all they have to do is allow them to grow beards. I don't think we need to have another war for troops to join the army. You guys keep posting comments on all of my videos, just let me grow a beard and I'll join the army. There you go, Army. That's the solution. But again, for real, we don't need a World War III. We are still very combat effective. It's going to take almost 10 years, a very long time for us to not be combat effective and to not be relevant. And hopefully we don't get into another conflict or war in that time, but let's be honest, it'll probably happen, unfortunately.